So let's jump in talking about the samurai and the code of Bushido. In 794 AD, the Japanese emperor moved the capital and the court from Nara, the city of Nara, to Kyoto. This became known as the Heian period, and it lasted from 794 until all the way up to the Tokugawa period in 1600. In some ways, you could even say it went to the Meiji period in the middle 1800s, because it ended up developing a particular kind of system called the shogun system. What happened is when they moved to Kyoto and the Heian period began, it was a flourishing of art and literature and of culture, but with the Heian period starting in the late 700s, it was a steady decline of the authority and power of the emperor and of the imperial court in the capital city. Technically, throughout all this period of time, the emperor was still ruling Japan from Kyoto during this Heian period, but the actual power was no longer, or fairly early on in the Heian period, was no longer in the hands of the emperor himself. It increasingly, the power reverted to various clan lords who were called daimyos. Daimyo literally means great lands or large lands, because they controlled large properties. And these daimyos or clan lords each had their own army of varying sizes, and the soldiers in that army were called the samurai. Now the samurai class really developed. In fact, the power of the daimyos developed and the emperor's power receded, because the central court in Kyoto, at first they had introduced a system called Ritsuryo, and that system was modeled after the Chinese. Part of it was that they divided up the land equally. In fact, in the Ritsuryo system in Japan, every child at age 6, and I recently read something that this included girls even, although they got lesser land, that every child was allotted the same size piece of land for raising crops, particularly rice. Rice was the primary diet and was the primary thing they raised. And in return for that, because all the land belonged to the state, all the land technically belonged to the emperor because of that, and so they gave pieces of land to every child, and through that child's life they were to raise rice on that, and a few other crops as well, but primarily rice. And then a percentage of that went back to the central government in Kyoto as a tax. It was like 3% of everything they grew, plus they had to pay a head tax for the people that they had in their family. Well, somebody had to collect that tax in order for the government to keep running. At first, the central government tried to do it, and then they started getting lazy, and they pushed more and more of the responsibility for tax collection out to the daimyos and their respective armies of samurai soldiers. And of course, there was a cut taken by the middleman before it got back to the capital. And in addition to that, the one problem that they ran into with this adaptation of the equal field system is that after they had allotted the land to these literally children who would grow up raising their crops and their families would work on it, there was uncultivated land that didn't fit into the system. And so finally, in order to get people to cultivate that land, they said, okay, if you cultivate the land, you can own it. At first they said for 3 years, it's yours, you get the benefit of it. But later on, they said, if you cultivate previously uncultivated land, then you own it forever. And you get a much higher percentage, you don't have to pay as much tax, etc. So these daimyos were not dummies. They started using their resources to cultivate the lands. It was also true that if you had a shrine, a Buddhist shrine or Shinto shrine or a temple on a piece of property, they didn't get taxed. So they would build shrines and temples on the corner of their property, and then they didn't have to pay tax on anything they did with it. Well, eventually, because the daimyos were in charge and the government in Kyoto was sort of receding in terms of their involvement, less and less tax was going to Kyoto, more and more power and money were going to the clan lords, the provincial lords, and their samurai armies. These armies were growing. And so over a period of time, the emperor had no power at all except as a figurehead. All of the power was out in the countryside with the daimyos and with their soldiers. Now, samurai were minor military nobility. They were the warrior class officers, and from medieval through early modern Japan. The word samurai literally means to wait upon, or one who accompanies, because the samurai were seen as always, there was a special class called ronin. If your master was killed and you didn't have another master, ronin was an unattached samurai, a samurai without a master. But samurai, almost all, were associated with serving one of the daimyos, one of the lords, or directly to the shogun that I'll talk about in a minute. There were three families during this Heian period that really grew in power and so took the power away from the emperor. The first one was called the Fujiwara Clan. Fairly early in the Heian period, the Fujiwara Clan, the head of the Fujiwara Clan, came up with this plan where if he could marry one of his daughters off to the emperor, then any sons they had would be his grandchildren, and he would feel a necessary, sort of maternal connection. And that means that the head of the Fujiwara clan could also take over responsibility as regent when the child was younger. This happened for generations and generations, where the Fujiwara clan would provide the wives for the young emperors when they first married, which meant when they became emperors, the father-in-law was actually the power behind the throne, and the emperor had virtually no power at all. And the Fujiwaras were among these daimyos, these very powerful clan families. Well, after a long, long period of time, two other families got tired of the Fujiwaras as regents having the real power in the country. So in the mid-12th century, two other clans, the Taira and the Minamotos, got together, and they defeated the Fujiwaras and threw them out of power and pushed them aside. They had a flare of some power additional later on. But then after the Taira and the Minamoto had defeated the Fujiwaras, the Taira defeated the Minamotos. And they started doing exactly what the Fujiwara had done. They were providing they provided a wife to the young emperor so that any children they bore would be part of that clan, and it started all over again. Well, after only about 20 years or so, the Minamoto clan decided that they were gaining more and more power out in the countryside, and they decided that they would fight back. These are just images of samurai. This is what you think of as samurai, and these are not bad examples. In 1180, the Minamotos went to war with various other daimyos supporting them against the Taira clan, and they ended up defeating them. The Taira were far more powerful at first, but through good strategy and luck, they ended up winning battles. All of these crossed swords here are places that they fought battles in this Jinpai war. And then finally, down here, there was a sea battle at Dan-no-ura, and this is a painting of it, in which the Minamotos in the sea battle conclusively defeated the Taira and took over in responsibility. Now, everybody expected that the Minamotos would do exactly what had been done previously, that they would go to Kyoto, the capital city, and they would basically take over the throne, even though they technically would still leave somebody sitting there. But the man who was the head of the Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoritomo, he decided not to do that. He went back to his own home, his castle, which was in Kamakura, right here. This is Kyoto, so it's quite a long distance away. So he went back to Kamakura and just decided that the emperor can stay on his throne. I'm not going to try to take over by providing wives or any of that kind of stuff. I'm not going to be regent because I now control the army. I'm just going to run the country. And so he began, Minamoto Yoritomo began the first of the shogunates. Now, the shogun, previously, starting in the late 700s, the Japanese emperor and court were fighting against or trying to conquer various native peoples that had lived on the islands of Japan, but not of the same ethnic group, particularly the Emishi and the Ainu peoples. Well, when they had generals fighting in the 700s and 800s and 900s, they gave the title to the senior commander, the Sei Ai Taishogun. Sei Ai Taishogun. That literally means the commander-in-chief of the expeditions against the barbarians. Shogun literally means one who leads warriors. So he is the general. Well, Minamoto no Yoritomo decided that instead of trying to go to Kyoto and take over, he would declare himself shogun. He shortened the title, the leader of the armies, and he would run the country. And the emperor could do whatever he wanted to because he had no power. He couldn't control the military, so he couldn't do anything else. At this point, Minamoto sets up what was called the Bakufu, which was a government structure, a bureaucratic structure that controlled not only military matters, but administrative matters and legal matters. He had various bureaucratic divisions that took care of the whole country, all of it supported by his samurai and the various other clan lords or daimyos who, with their samurai, had agreed to support him for that. Now, as shogun, as military dictator, he had absolute power. And he declared that this position was going to be hereditary, that his son would take over after him. So the emperor, Emperor, you can do whatever you want over there in Kyoto. We don't really care because we're running the country from this point. The Kamakura Shogunate, as it's called, the Minamotos, they lasted until 1338. A second group, or second family clan, took over then, the Ashikaga clans, and they created what was called the Muromachi Shogunate because they named them after where they lived. The Kamakura Shogunate is because Minamoto lived in Kamakura. So the Ashikagos, who take over in 1338, they lived in Muromachi, which was sort of a suburb of Kyoto. And then in 1600, the last major shogunate, the Tokugawa Shogunate, takes over for the Edo period, and they move the capital to Tokyo. Now, so there's three major shogunates, but they last from the late 1100s until the Tokugawa Shogunate did not lose power and leave authority until the mid-1800s, actually 1868, during the Meiji Restoration. It's called that because they restored power to the Meiji Emperor and by taking it away from the shoguns, all right? So that's the history. The Japanese did not refer to these soldiers as samurai very often. I mean, that is a word that they used, but they usually would refer to them as bushi, which means warrior. And in a few minutes I'm going to talk about Bushido, which is the way of the warrior, although the term Bushido did not come into common use until the 19th century, long after the samurai were gone. Everybody now thinks about the Code of Bushido as being what they followed. Well, it was, but they didn't have that name for it at that time. The daimyo, the wealthy landowners who became independent of the central power, it was always a challenge for them to grow, to put together the strongest army they could, the strongest group of samurais, because they would constantly battle each other. In fact, there was a period of time after Minamoto took over called the Warring Period, in which chaos reigned. And I gave you a very simple history. There was a lot of back and forth and in and out kinds of stuff. But after Minamoto came in, the samurai became a very respected public class. They were more than just warriors. This is part of it. We think of them as being, swords flying and all of that sort of thing, which they did. They were a martial class. They were a military class. But the samurai were more than just warriors. To be a samurai, you were expected to be very literate. Ideally, you would be a poet. You needed to be highly educated, highly cultured. You need to be one who exemplified a balance between war and learning. In fact, they had an expression then, bunburyodo, which means the pen and the sword in accord. So you had to be learned, you had to be accomplished in military things. The samurai were expected to practice calligraphy. They were great practitioners of the tea ceremony. They wrote poetry, they played music, they studied. So they were expected to be much more than just soldiers. And in fact, during the Edo period, which started in 1603 basically, the fact that the samurai were all literate, and many of them taught literacy, Japan was more literate than anywhere else in the world, more literate than Western Europe. They had more people who could read because the samurai set the example for people who could read. They were pretty terrifying in battle. The samurai were extraordinary warriors. We all get that image from the various movies and that sort of thing, but samurai battles, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, some of the samurai battles, because the clan lords would side with each other and their armies would get together, we have samurai battles in which between 160,000 and 200,000 warriors are going at each other. And it's quite an extraordinary thing. As I mentioned, the samurai were part of a formal hierarchy. In 702, early 700s, they developed what was called the Taiko Code. Again, adapting some things that they had pulled over from China, and it established a formal hierarchy for everyone in society. They had multiple levels, and these are just the large levels. They had multiple levels of nobility, and in fact, they were required at one point to wear different colors in order to clearly identify what social status you had in the society. But I don't know if you can read this. At the top is the emperor, and right below the emperor is court nobility. Now, during the time, after Minamoto started the shogunate, those were just figureheads. They were in charge in name only. They pretty much stayed in Kyoto. All of the power was in Kamakura or the other cities of the later shoguns and in the daimyos. But from that point, the shogun was really the ruler of the country. Below the shogun were the daimyo, the large landowners, the clan lords. Most of them had some either family affiliation or a history of loyalty to the shogun. There was a lot of connection here, family connections, historical connections that tied the samurai to daimyos and daimyos to the shogun. And then under the daimyos you have the samurai. Below the samurai are peasants, which are primarily farmers, the craftsmen, people who made things, and then the merchants. In ancient Japan, they had very little regard for someone who just sold things or bought things because they didn't make anything. It wasn't until much, much later, after the Meiji Restoration, during the Meiji period, that the country, in seeking to make itself wealthier and to become more like Western nations, merchants began to be valued. But during all this period of time, the merchants were the lowest level of their whole social structure. And the samurai were held in such high regard that any of these below them, the peasants, craftsmen, or merchants, which were the vast majority of people, of course, any of those, a samurai, if he felt he was not being sufficiently respected, he could just kill a commoner, and there was no penalty. He had the power to kill anyone who was not showing him proper respect. I say him, there were some female, but very, very few, all right? Less than 10%, it's not like every man in Japan was samurai or carried swords. Less than 10% of the Japanese population were ever part of the samurai military order because it was a minor nobility. You didn't just, decide, hey, I think I'm going to be a samurai. It was something that you had to be born into and then develop. Of the total number of samurai, about 1.3 million of them were considered high samurai, and about 500,000 low samurai. The difference is the high samurai would ride horses. It was considered a great honor to ride horses. Not just anyone could ride a horse either. So the high samurai were samurai who were higher level, allowed to ride horses into battle. The low samurai were those who fought on foot. Now, you've seen all of the armor and maybe some idea of the weapons. I want to talk about that for just a few minutes. It's interesting that Francis Xavier, the Jesuit missionary and who traveled in Asia, he once said that there is no people who fear death less than the Japanese. And so the whole warrior structure was built into their culture and society. But particularly because of the fact that Shinto and Confucianism and Zen Buddhism. Now, most of the rest of Japan was not practicing Zen Buddhism. They were practicing other kinds that I'll talk about tomorrow. But Zen Buddhism was practiced widely by samurai because it gave them a calm. It both gave them calm, the meditative practices of Zen, whether it was when they were going into battle, it helped them deal with the fear of death. And it also gave them calm when they were killing other people. You know, they felt like they could deal with it. Confucianism was very important in this time because Confucianism has a very high emphasis on loyalty, particularly recognizing your place in society, who you are beneath, and what loyalty you owe to those people. And I'm going to talk about the values in a second, but the primary value for the samurai was loyalty to your lord, even above your family. Family was important, but even above your family, whoever your master was, your daimyo, whoever was above you in authority, in the hierarchy, you had an obligation to serve them, and that was your highest calling. Amongst the samurai, they developed a wide range of weapons. Of course, the one they're most known for is the katana, the long sword, and then they had a shorter version of it called the wakizashi, and then a knife, which is called the tanto knife. They even call it that. Now tanto knife means a blade that has an angled tip on it, right? You can get a tanto pocket knife now. But those three swords, the katana, the wakizashi, and the tanto, were the mark of the samurai. Usually they only carried two. The wakizashi they did not usually carry, but they were called sometimes the daisho. Daisho literally means two swords. And only the samurai were allowed to carry swords. This was a mark of their position, along with a particular kind of hairdo that involved a top knot. Those only samurai were allowed to maintain those. They, in addition to the swords, they often fought with yumi, which are bows. It is the bow of the Japanese martial arts, which is called kyudo. Kyudo is the art of the bow, as they call it. And I don't think you can really tell from this image, these are bows, but the Japanese bow that they use in kyudo and is very different than what most people have seen, because it's not even on either end of the handle. Because they fought from horseback, they developed a bow that was shorter on the bottom and longer on the top. In fact, sometimes they're enormous on the top. You know, they're 8 or 9 feet long. And so, but you don't have to have your hand and you draw in the center in order to get the additional power from the length of the bow. And so it's very different. If you've ever watched kyudo being practiced as a martial art, the bows are very different than what we're used to. They also use various kinds of spears and on poles. If you were a samurai that fought on foot, the best defense you had, or the best offense even, against a mounted samurai was to have a spear, or some sort of pole weapon. And so they had varieties of those, as you can see here, that allowed them to fight on foot and still have a chance against a mounted warrior. Later on, particularly in the mid-1500s, when the Portuguese came to Japan and visited, they found out about weapons, about guns. And so after the mid-late 1500s, many of the Japanese warriors, many of the samurai, would use what were called kanegashimas. Kanegashima was a matchlock rifle, which literally had like a little wick that was burning, and when you fired it, that wick went down and lit the pan, the gunpowder in the pan, in order to fire the thing. They were not accurate, but you get enough out of them and you point them all in the same direction, they could be devastating. They also had cannon later on, which they would put on castles and ships. They didn't have field cannon, but they did use them on castles and ships. They had various other kinds of truncheons and clubs and that sort of thing. And, of course, as you see here, particularly visually striking is the armor that they used. This was called the yoroi. The yoroi was a lamellar armor. It was layered. It was either leather that was lacquered until it was quite hard, or sometimes they would use metal plates, iron plates, and lacquer it. The various pieces would be sewn together. Part of it would be leather, hardened leather. A full yoroi armor would be like 65 to 70 pounds of weight, not as heavy as the kind of armor, the plate armor that they wore in medieval Europe. But later on, as weapons with gunpowder started being used more, they did have plate armor that were sometimes worn by the samurai. I want to talk for a second about Bushido. which literally means the way of the warrior, the ethical code that the samurai followed. The comparison that I have here, I'll back up so you can see it. This is a samurai knight killing a dragon. I don't know that they did that a lot, but that image is of him killing a dragon. This is a Western European knight killing a dragon. And I put this up here because there are some similarities. You can't push this too far because it falls apart. But there are some similarities between what we understand as the code of chivalry that they had in Europe that the knights were supposed to follow, and the code of Bushido, which literally means the way of the warrior. Do, anytime you see do, it means the way of. So Bushido, the way of the warrior. Chivalry in Western Europe really began in the 800s under Charlemagne, when he became the Holy Roman Emperor, the French, or Frank, he wasn't French yet, but the Frank leader Charlemagne. And so they began to develop chivalry. It really developed mostly in the late 1100s and 1200s. Now, the whole principle behind chivalry is, if you have somebody who is trained as a warrior, which the knights were, the knights were mounted warriors, and they don't have anybody to fight, what happens? They look for somebody to fight. Either they fight each other, or they decide they're going to raid villages, or they kill peasants. And so, first under Charlemagne, and then later on in the medieval period, they came up with rules, and the church was involved in part of this. For instance, the church passed rules about, okay, you can't kill peasants, you can't kill anybody on a Sunday or a holy day, and various other rules. But particularly, the idea behind chivalry was that there was first a warrior ethos. That it's not just, okay, I've got a sword, so I'm gonna be in an army. There was a whole ethos, a culture of being a warrior. There was a piety, a knightly piety. This is where the church came in. If you read the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, a lot of that is very religious. They're searching for the Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus drank from. And so there was a piety. And again, part of that was they were making that part of chivalry because they felt like that would keep these guys in control a little bit. There was a sense of courtly manners, that there were, that they, being the well-to-do, the wealthy, all of the knights came from titled families, that they had a responsibility to be courtly and kind, honor, nobility. Noblesse oblige is the expression where those who are noble have an obligation for those who are not as fortunate. All of this was part of chivalry. Now you compare that to Bushido. Bushido really started slightly earlier than chivalry in Western Europe in the 8th century, but then developed a lot in the 13th to 16th century. They focused on, first, reckless courage. An absolute, as I say, Francis Xavier was quoted as saying, there's no people that have less fear of death than the Japanese. So a willingness to go into battle, even if you were absolutely sure that you probably would be killed. They had an extreme devotion to whoever their lord was, whoever their daimyo was, and to their family, but in that order. The daimyo came first. They believed in cultivating the intellect and the culture of all of the things that were associated with culture, poetry and calligraphy and the tea ceremony and all of that. They focused on developing the martial arts, hand-to-hand fighting, use of the sword, use of the spear, use of the bow. So there was a great discipline for that. They had focused indifference to suffering and discomfort. To complain about something being uncomfortable would be completely wrong to a samurai warrior. They had disregard for material wealth. The samurai were never paid, other than they were given a share of the crops that they helped gather, and they were given the right to demand service from some of the lower level commoners. But they never got money for it. In fact, that would have been completely foreign to their whole thinking. They never got anything other than food and services for it. They also focused on honor, honesty, compassion, generosity, and self-discipline. But it went so far in terms of their martial, their military inclinations, that they considered it dishonorable to be taken by an enemy, to surrender, or to lose a battle that you were fighting for your master. Those were dishonorable things. They considered it dishonorable to show any mercy to an enemy that was defeated, even if that enemy was women and children. And because of the fact that the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army tried to engender the spirit of Bushido in the Japanese warriors of the Second World War, you can understand from these principles that why some of the Japanese military did the things they did. They were completely ruthless to captured enemies because they considered for them to surrender to be dishonorable, and that they were worthy of no consideration at that point. And the willingness to commit suicide, the kamikaze pilots and others, all of this they saw as a rebirth of the code of Bushido in their lives. Now, as I said earlier, the Bushido was based partly in Zen, and that gave them the calm that they needed, but also the Confucianism gave them a sense of personal responsibility for the position that they had and loyalty to their Lord. So a combination of Shinto, of Zen Buddhism, of Confucianism gave them this serenity and the discipline to move forward. There are all kinds of quotes from samurai leaders saying things like this. This is a quote from one of them. "It is shameful for a man to die without having first risked his life in battle." They thought that was what every man should do, is you have to be enough of a warrior at least once to have risked your life. They focused on righteousness, heroic courage, benevolence and compassion, respect, integrity, honor, duty, and loyalty. Now, in the event that you failed in your responsibility, the way that you could regain your honor was to commit seppuku. We used to call it harikiri, which those words are still known, but seppuku was the appropriate name for it. Harikiri means literally belly cutting. As one of our guides said earlier on one of our visits in Japan, that the two swords, the daisho that they carried, the long sword was to kill other people, and the short sword was to kill yourself. The tanto. And the idea was that if you had failed your master in some way, if you had dishonored yourself or your family, and some of this goes back to the religious beliefs. In Shinto, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, Shinto, if you died a less than sterling death, meaning if you didn't do something spectacular along the way, then you might end up in a place called Yomi, which is a place of darkness and shadow, which was a terrible thing, and you would be forgotten. So the idea was, if you have failed your master, if you have had to surrender, if for any other way you've lost honor as a samurai, the only way to get it back was to commit seppuku. This image here is of a general. This is General Akashi Gideyu. He is preparing to commit seppuku. This drawing is of him preparing to commit seppuku because he lost a battle that he was fighting in the name of his master. And you'll notice he has just finished writing his death poem. The tradition is you write a death poem. Now, the reason that seppuku was seen as a way to regain your honor is that seppuku is a very painful, very slow death. One of the major generals in the Japanese military who committed seppuku after the emperor said that they were going to surrender, it took him like 10 hours to die. In fact, it's so painful and takes so long, it's been more common for someone to stab themselves and cut their stomach open, and just at the moment of greatest pain have a friend, a colleague, cut their heads off. Be standing there with a sword and take their head off. Do you know the writer Yukio Mishima, who wrote The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea? He's a brilliant writer. Well, he was very much a traditionalist, and so because he felt Japan was going in the wrong direction, he committed seppuku publicly in an elevated area over Main Street. But after he had committed seppuku, he had one of his disciples cut his head off. And that was only 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So this sort of thing still happens. And this image here is a battle that was in 1597, where 160,000 samurai fought. So they had enormous battles when they got all of them together. Eventually, I've talked a lot about the Meiji Restoration in 1866 to 68, in which the Satsuma and Chosen daimyos, it recruited others. They defeated the Tokugawa shogun, reestablished the Meiji Emperor as being the authority. But unfortunately for them, shortly after that, but in 1868 they sort of put the emperor back on his throne in a real way, and in 1873, just 5 years later, the Meiji Emperor abolished the samurai. There actually was a minor rebellion because they didn't know that's what was going to happen if they fought for the emperor. And his desire, the Meiji Emperor wanted to create a modern conscription army. And so the idea of having this very old-fashioned sword-bearing military of the samurai who were a particular class rather than being taken from all peoples was not what he was looking for. And so he announced in 1873 that the samurai could no longer wear the daisho, the two swords. They could no longer wear the top knot. They could no longer execute commoners who were disrespectful to them. And they changed from samurai, he gave them the name shizoku, because he needed to give them some place in society. At that point they had the kazoku, who were the nobility, the daimyos, and they had the commoners, but the samurai were in between, so he named them the tizoku, which means warrior families, but they no longer had any rights. They gave all of them a sort of a retirement fund, they would get retirement, but then for financial reasons, the government convinced most of them to take it all out in a lump sum, and these weren't business people. Many of them lost their money, and they actually had to pass new laws that it was not illegal for a samurai to become a weaver or to do some other activity in order to support himself and his family. But many of them went on to be in the military or to work in corporations, etc. So but it was a huge blow to them. It was a trauma to the society when everything got changed by the emperor, the Meiji Emperor. And these are two elderly samurai who can no longer wear the swords, and there were a lot of them. Now today, I mentioned already a little bit about this. In recent times, and even today, the idea of Bushido, of the warrior code, has been used by various people in authority to try to engender a certain kind of discipline or aggressiveness or whatever. In the Second World War is a good example of that. They really engendered for all of the soldiers in the Japanese military a dedication to the emperor. Remember that loyalty to the one who is above you. So dedication to the emperor, the idea that defeat is shameful, that surrender is dishonorable, that no compassion should be shown for any defeated enemies, including women and children, that there was no reason that they were unworthy for any compassion, and that anyone who surrenders for any reason is worthy of only contempt. There was never a reason to surrender. And in fact, some of the things, like on the Battle of Iwo Jima, the commanding general of the Japanese told them that if each of the Japanese soldiers did not kill 10 US soldiers, they would die dishonorably. Which is why, on Iwo Jima and other places, that kind of thinking was why they would do these massive, almost suicidal rushes, what they came to call banzai rushes on our side. And in fact, it's been said that if the Japanese military in the Second World War had not tried to create or engender this Bushido attitude, this Bushido mentality in their soldiers, they probably would not have done a lot of the things that ended up being counterproductive. They would not have lost a lot of their soldiers in these mass suicidal charges into machine guns and artillery and that sort of thing. That they probably could have adopted better strategies than that, except they had really created this kind of mindset. This is the mindset that the kamikazes, that is those, and it wasn't just planes, but particularly we think of the planes, crashing planes into Allied vessels in order to try to sink them. They also had mini submarines that were suicidal. They had divers that were suicidal. They unfortunately would train some children to run under tanks and explode a bomb. And those were all considered part of the kamikaze, or special attack units, they formerly were called. All of this sort of was an adaptation, you might even say an abuse, of the whole Bushido code, of the whole samurai mindset. But there have been no samurai, there has been no formal Bushido since the 1873. So that's the samurai. Questions about any of that? Questions? No one. Bueller? Bueller? Okay, well, if there's no questions, oh yes, Tom?
I understood that the Bushido Code was quite violent training.
Well, the training part of, training for samurai was violent. You know, it was a very rigorous discipline. I mean, people could die during that training. That wasn't actually the Bushido Code. The code was sort of the moral and the justification for all of that. But in terms of the actual training, I mean, they were trained with weapons, and it was dangerous. So yeah, and it was pretty very severe. Yeah. All right. Yes.
With the samurai, their sons became samurai also. But what if they didn't meet the requirements? They weren't that strong.
Yeah. So the samurai, you had to be part of the noble class, and someone was a samurai was expected. Their sons would probably be samurai as well. Well, what if they didn't cut it? You know, they would probably wash out, be dishonored. They might be expected to commit seppuku, but they might just go on and become a farmer as well. You know, I don't. They would go down in the class structure. I don't have an exact answer to that. I don't know the exact answer to that. I'm only imagining from the things I've read how they would deal with that. But because they would have been raised from, you know, youngest childhood in this martial kind of environment, then I would imagine not many of them failed in that, because it was so much a part of their culture, and they existed in this from, you know, almost from birth, if they were going to go that direction. Yes, in the back.
Do you know of any counterpart to samurai in other Asian or other civilizations?
Do I know of any other counterparts to the samurai in other civilizations? Well, I mentioned chivalry in Western Europe as being an example where the knights were expected to follow a particular code, and that there are similarities there, although you can't push it too far. There obviously were militaries in Korea and in China, but I don't know of any military orders there that were as rigorous. When you get over to Persia, there were, in fact, we get the word assassin from a word which was basically they were trained as kind of special forces killers. During the same time you had samurai, I think I mentioned this once before, they also had ninjas. But whereas the samurai were the visible soldiers and they would gather together in an army and fight in a battle, the ninjas were assassins. They were secretive. They were spies who would work behind the scenes and were not identified. They didn't all wear black, you know, with black masks and the whole thing, because you couldn't recognize them from anybody else, was the point. And so they had other specialties as well, but the samurai were the majority of them. So yeah, there were special force kind of things in other places, the assassins being one example of it. But samurai are fairly unique. I think that's one of the reasons they're so fascinating, is because they were quite different. Here first and then there. Yes?
How did the society change this pattern and this agreement on what they were doing?
How did the society change this pattern? Well, the society didn't. The Meiji Emperor did in 1873. He said no more. And they had just, it was the samurai and the daimyos that had just 5 years earlier put him back in authority. And in fact, there was a Satsuma rebellion once they realized what he was doing. But the emperor declared, this is where we're going with this. We're not going to do that anymore. And even though there was a rebellion, they failed, and he succeeded in just getting rid of the samurai and creating a completely different military that was conscripted from all different levels of society. Yes?
These katanas, the swords, they were notoriously good blades.
Right.
Steel making. Is that correct? Is that the previous?
That's absolutely true. The Japanese katanas. How many of you went to the museum today? The Kyushu Museum? Okay, some of you did. Did you notice that they had on display a couple of blades without handles and everything else? The point being, it wasn't the beautiful, the beautiful handles or the scabbards or anything else. It was the actual blade that was the work of art. And there are schools that are specifically named, and you can pay a king's fortune for one of the old samurai katanas or any of the blades made from one of the famous schools because their workmanship, the metallurgy of combining softer metal so that it's not brittle, but blending them together. If you look at a katana blade or any well-made sword, you'll notice sort of a moire pattern along the edge. That's because they have with a hammer, they have blended different kinds of metal together so that the metal that will sharpen the best is on the edge, but the back is not made out of the same brittler material that can be sharpened so that it maintains strength. They were some of the sharpest and strongest blades ever made, probably exceeding Toledo in Spain. And so yeah, the samurai, I'm fascinated by the swords. My wife has told me that I can do almost anything I want except buy a sword. Yes.
What if metal was an issue, not a resource they had? Where did they get this metal?
Well, I mean, obviously they were importing metal, but it doesn't take a whole lot to make an extraordinary sword,
They made a lot of them.
And they made a lot of them. They did, and the majority, there are different classes of swords. For the Japanese military in the Second World War, most of the swords they made were not that great. I mean, they weren't spectacular. We're talking about the swords of the daimyos and the top samurai, those who were famous swordsmen. They would have been that sort of works of art, but the majority of them would be pretty straight, pretty simple. And they were getting metal in. That was what they were doing by taking over properties and dealing. They were trading for that sort of thing.